Welcome to the session today. We're going to be talking about architecting for a great developer experience. Just to set the context a little bit before we really dive in, getting great developer experience doesn't come by accident. It's something that you need to work on, whether that's having great tools or changing the processes or the culture, to really get the outcome of, empowering engineers, allowing them to innovate, having that great culture where they actually feel happy in their jobs and delivering great outcomes for the business. That takes planning and time. So joining me to talk about that today, I have Helen Greel. She's the VP of Engineering at Multiverse. Welcome.
Thank you.
Why don't we get started by you telling me a little bit about your history before we really dive into the meat of this?
Awesome. Excited to be here, Martin. Thank you for having me. One of my favorite events, Developer Experience Summit by Harness. So about me a little bit, I've spent a bit of time architecting developer experience in large orgs and small orgs of all sorts of kinds and challenges. Overall, it's a decade, almost more than a decade of working with platform teams, optimizing for developer happiness, for developer effectiveness. I worked with platform teams at Spotify. I used to lead a backstage developer experience team at Spotify, and now basically architecting developer experience for my new gig, Multiverse, the educational company who kind of is trying to identify, diagnose, and prevent the gaps in skills through applied learning on the job. So.
Wow, that's a lot of history, a lot of experience. So based on that, why don't we jump straight in? And where I really wanted to start is, what are the kind of foundations, the fundamentals of where you start when you're kind of designing or building out a great developer experience?
Well, slightly uncomfortable thing to say, I guess, but it all starts with maybe us stopping to pretend that we know what developers need just because we were developers once, right? So the advice that I give to a lot of the backstage customers in the past, and this is how I operate as well, you can't design a great developer experience without walking a mile in developer shoes. And there are many ways to do that. So you can just tap your developer on the shoulder and shadow what they do for a day. You can ask them to document their steps. And it was fascinating for me when I joined a new company just to realize it takes 42 steps to build a backend service and develop it to production. 42 goddamn steps. I have some work to do there, obviously.
That is quite a lot.
And typically, my steer is to organize and architect around developer workflows, understand what it takes to create something, understand what it takes to troubleshoot an incident, or understand a new code base for your developer and start basically following the steps of the developer day-to-day workflow and automating or optimizing those journeys one by one. This is true solid foundation to me, and that touches on things like CI/CD, right? Just the basic operational stuff. It touches on things like observability. Does it all come to the same place? Can you easily follow and trace everything that happened in case something goes sideways? So yeah, just table stakes, right? But we gotta start with table stakes with boring stuff.
Yeah, and actually I think it's interesting that you talk about the whole experience end to end. Mostly because I think quite often people focus on the bits of it, right? So I love that approach of saying, no, you have to look at it, the whole thing holistically. So I guess one of the things I'm picking up there is what you're really saying is focus on your customer, where your engineer is your customer.
Right. Yeah, and they're a customer just wearing the same, you're wearing a badge from the same company, right? But yeah, they're your customer. And I guess we truly have to practice that customer centricity when it comes to platform teams serving everybody else or developer experience teams serving everybody else. Just do the thing that you do with your customers, create a roadmap, do user research, follow metrics, slap, the development life cycle on it, make it clear if it's a beta product, if it's GA, so people know when to engage, how to engage, just real standard product development practices when it comes to your developer tools.
Yeah, which actually leads me on to the next thing where, honestly, is, platform is a product, or developer experience is a product. You know, and you talked about there about, you know, labeling it, when to engage, and, you know, so what are some of the fundamental things that you would put into that product? And, you know, how do you make sure you're targeting the right things kind of first, you know, especially given what you were just saying about understanding, like, you know, where are the things that are going to remove the most friction, and how do you identify those?
Totally. I mean, like in my experience of like engaging with teams, like building developer experience for customers, as well as like building developer experience for my own teams, like there are sometimes like those forks in the roads of like optimizing for visibility as opposed to like optimizing for automation potentially. And like there are slightly different approaches, and there is no kind of right or wrong. It just sometimes like you don't know what your ecosystem looks like. So like people are trying to centralize, visualize, like make discovery easy, and that's like we're talking about things like catalog, documentation, search discovery, service discovery, things like that. The other approach is more like it takes so many steps for developers to create certain things, to manage certain things, like how can we automate and make it like a more streamlined, which is a bit more of like automated first approach. And there isn't really like a right or wrong, as long as like you know what is your North Star goal, like what are your kind of biggest pain points that you're trying to optimize for. And just like maybe one slight kind of hot take here as well, I've seen lots of like vanity metrics, as in like adoption of product X is Y, but I'm like, so what? Like what's the impact? And it's a really big shift in the mindset of, which is like also product mindset, because like when you ship a product to external customer, you're not so obsessed about like adoption, you're obsessed about like the outcome, the real business outcome. And this is the key here. Like if you shipped, I don't know, unified authentication framework, like what's in it for your bottom line, actually, like what's the business outcome? So I'm always kind of pushing for that product mindset in developer experience metrics.
So I absolutely love that you went all the way to the outcomes, because I think sometimes that's missing. It's really interesting because the examples you were giving, I've previously done a webinar before with two companies who were both SaaS, and one of them took that we need to fix the automation because that is the biggest problem that our engineers are telling us about. And the other one went the discoverability route. But the joy of that thing from that particular session for me was those two companies going, okay, but now I want to learn from you and I want to learn from you, right? Because yes, we're getting some of the outcomes we want, but now we need the outcomes that you have, and vice versa. And so, you know, I think you're absolutely right. Those approaches really work. So I also want to loop back to that outcomes. So where do you drive those outcomes to ultimately? Are you driving from the outcomes for the customer, the engineering community? And are those aligned with the outcomes for the overall business?
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate goal, like we always want to be kind of moving the bottom line for the organization we work for. Like that's the ultimate goal, like everything we do. Sometimes it makes it like super hard to link some of those kind of leading metrics to some of the lagging metrics, especially if we're talking like, I don't know, inner loop of a developer and like units shipped to production versus like bottom line of a company that has like 200 million in revenue. That's a hard thing to justify, but like it's not impossible, right? And there are things like usually we work backwards from like what is it that business is trying to do, and if it's like scaling the revenue without scaling investment in like R&D in your development, we can work with that. And if it means that like what becomes important is revenue per developer, that gives you the goal, right? Of like it's ultimately figuring out what's important for your stakeholders and also anchoring to those metrics. So it's not like engineers doing engineering in the corner, but like this is how this team is driving business impact for company X.
Yeah, and I got to admit, I've seen that as more and more of a trend generally, you know, where that kind of end-to-end vision of, hey, the product team and the business has this vision, and actually it's aligned all the way across the engineering team, because while the way they implement to get those desired outcomes might be different, right? More efficient engineering processes, maybe more automation, whatever that is, it's also aligned with we want to increase our customer base, or we want to reduce our overheads, you know? So I think getting that alignment is really, really critical. So I kind of want to stay here, but I also want to, like, I'm torn between two topics.
I see the urge.
Yeah. I think where I'd like to go next is, you know, because we're kind of talking about aligning, you know, engineering outcomes with business outcomes, you know, really, how do you see the way culture and leadership and all of those things fit together to make this work?
Totally. I mean, it's like cultural transformations are never easy, right? But this is like the secret sauce on every transformation, be it like developer experience focus, be it more product focus. And developers are not only like reading emails and presentations and slides, they read the room, right? So like what leaders are saying and what most importantly, like leaders are saying constantly is what sort of gets picked up as a culture. And then like I've seen multiple CTOs where like they demo a new product feature and they demo a new developer experience kind of feature or like something, a new developer tool. And that is sending like a clear signal, like those things are of equal importance.
Yeah.
Or like you see developer sentiment as part of like the board report, like a quarterly board report. That means like somebody is paying attention. And it's never like this big bang transformation, oh, we're now like developer first. It never is this. It's more like follow through on small steps consistently and asking the same questions over and over and over consistently. And like my way of doing this is also like reporting on those metrics upwards, like here is what's happening, just to raise awareness, and asking of my leaders, like what's your sort of what's your developer experience score for your team right now? Like, what are the trends? Why is it moving like this way or that way? What are you doing about it? And that creates like a really healthy feedback loop and creates a really healthy culture. Well, like, this becomes a topic of the conversation.
No, I love that, because essentially that is, you want to build that groundswell. You want your customer base, internal customer base, to be engaged, but you do need that kind of sponsorship from above.
Always.
You're never actually going to have that great success if you don't have both pushing both ways. And I had a previous CEO who talked about transformations, and he said we never do a transformation of one part of the business. We always do all the business. And the reason we do all the business is because culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we have to change the culture to change the strategy, which I thought was really interesting and kind of overlaps with what you're saying of, making sure it's all the way to the top and you're pushing things up and, and down. So coming to that next piece, really, which is, we've mentioned it a couple of times around reporting up and the metrics and, I think I know where you're going to go with this, but I could be completely wrong. But what are the right set of metrics? Is there some core fundamental ones? And then are the others, depending on your business and the desired outcomes, or is there a way to map from one to the other? How do you get there, and how do you kind of help identify those? What are the kind of practical steps?
Yeah, I mean, there are some really good frameworks out there because there is like fire hose of metrics, and like you don't want anyone to drink from that. It's just like you can easily get overwhelmed. And like I really admire like Core 4 framework, for instance, from DevEx, because that gives you like a really nice translation layer for some of your business stakeholders and for your teams as well. Like things like speed, quality, developer experience index. And like if someone is interested, they can drill down into like time to production or like inner loop of a developer, like outer loop of a developer. But you can also have a meaningful conversation just staying at that level. I think fundamentally, like what I've seen most traction with is like speed, is in like time to market, time to value, time to customer, like whatever interpretation of that is. Like everybody wants that. And the hard truth is that like nobody really cares about developer experience, like unless product is not delivering on their kind of not delivering the pace that people want to see, like then it becomes the conversation. But what is actually slowing us down? So speed is like of essence to me. Quality, like depending on the criticality of the business, like always like it pretty much brings like a really good conversation about like defects escape, number of incidents, maybe like reliability, downtime. Developer experience is like less maybe common, less mainstream, but still there is a way to kind of talk about it in a form of like regrettable attrition, just like overall retention of your workforce, like more of a gut check to kind of complement the hard metrics, right, with that. So like those three anchors to me are really kind of the main ones. There is something maybe around like operational efficiency or like financial efficiency because of like the environment we're in, like doing more with less. So yeah, like revenue per developer becomes a thing more like FinOps steps metrics become more popular. But ultimately, like core 4 to me is like a really good start if you don't have anything right now.
Yeah, I've actually sat us at like ask the expert tables, and that has been one of the most common questions I've been asked is, where do I start with the metrics? And I'm like, well, just start with the basics, right? Because that is the easiest way to get going. And then, find a way to align those with what the business is doing, because that's how you get that buy-in for that developer experience. I mean, some of the more mature companies I've seen have really kind of tied their end customers experience to the developer experience. They're saying, hey, do you know what? Our NPS scores for our end customers go up when our developers' NPS score is better. And I did like that as a metric. It feels a little bit disconnected, but I get the logic behind it. If you have happy engineers who are consistently working, solving problems, delivering great outcomes, then guess what? They're delivering better product. And if they're delivering better product, our customers are more happy too. So then it's kind of like a win-win.
Yeah, definitely no surprise there. Like, in fact, we had that correlation drawn. There was like multiple layers of like metrics that led to that, but effectively there was a correlation between developer satisfaction and NPS in the like Spotify user app.
Yeah.
So like we were able to prove that correlation. But yeah, 100%, it's a thing.
Yeah, I love that correlation. And so, again, I feel like there's 100 other metrics we could talk about. The one thing I would say is on metrics, how do you make sure that you're covering that whole software development lifecycle? How do you make sure that you're getting, right from ideation all the way through to kind of operations, and you did touch on that, but I think, we tend to start in that middle bit, like here's something that needs to be built, and here's something that's been delivered, or here's some bug that needs to be fixed, and here's, the outcome, it's been deployed to the customer. But we both know, and probably most people watching this know, that life cycle is actually much longer and much more intertwined. So are there any techniques to make sure that you're kind of over time, you can include those extra bits to kind of get that fuller picture?
Totally. That's $1 million question. Like to be able to really cover like the actual life cycle from like ideation or spec to production, not only like code review to deployment. Like there aren't great ways of like just deploying this on day one, and it's a hard part of like workflow to instrument, obviously. I think what we've found like quite successful with like trying to kind of course correct in the early stages of like just like early validation, basically, of like where is this idea going from like product manager, perhaps like designing, like envisioning a concept, and ask like before we write the first line of code, is there anything we could do to actually prove if like this idea is worth exploring? And I think this is where like maybe prototyping tools are really helpful, because you can actually kind of try to get some validation before you actually engage in like the further steps in the software development lifecycle. So like the thing that we do usually with customers, they're like more business focused oftentimes. It's like you basically seeing is believing. Like you create a quick prototype with something like Replit or something like Lovable, and just basically go around on a bit of a roadshow. And we found like such a meaningful decrease of like this early stage in the life cycle from like ideation to build by just doing early prototyping and early feedback with customers. But this part is really hard to measure.
Yeah, it is hard to measure. And I have seen that same things in some of the more mature teams I've worked with in the past, where they kind of had that process of, hey, if we spend this much time up front, it actually saves us this much time in the delivery because we know better what we're delivering.
Exactly.
So, but you're right, it is hard to measure, and I think you almost have to have some of the metrics before you start doing that to be able to measure the impact, which is always hard.
Yeah, some early signals are helpful, but like it's hard to gauge them at this stage, I think.
I think so. So that kind of leads me to, where are we going in the future? Like what is our, what are the things that are coming up that are going to help drive better developer experiences, help them get planned better, help them get implemented better, help us see beyond those current horizons into those broader horizons, and really help us get more and more aligned, right, with the kind of standard ways of working with the businesses that we work in, and the teams that are working and the outcomes that we're trying to drive.
Well, it's going to be Helen looking into her crystal ball, right, for this one.
Yeah.
So like definitely where I'm placing my bets right now is like context is king in terms of like with proliferation of like all LLM power tools, Gen AI power tools, like what you feed into them is context. And this basically forces our hands to also be like a bit more rigorous around our code base, because like there are many things that we take for granted as like human beings that we can work around, that like your regular agent working with your code base won't be able to work around. So where I see like the actual innovation and maybe step change in developer experience happening is that like, I guess first we're gonna feed like with maybe developer platforms and developer portals being like the source of so much context. It's going to be like a layer connecting agents to tools or like agents to agents. So like IDP is the new MCP basically, is like the idea that I'm bullish on personally. Like we'll see if this is the future. And the analogy that I like to give is that like we have this vacuum cleaner thing, right, at home, like automatic robot vacuum cleaner. But if I leave socks on the ground, like it doesn't matter how powerful the thing is, it's gonna trip. And similarly with like code base, like you need to have a clean like foundation, you need to have some sense of like relevant documentation in order to feed this context into the thing. So definitely, and I think what I see this future of developer experience going is potentially like looking at this journey again, like what are the steps in software development lifecycle, and maybe what are the stages we can actually delegate completely to agents with like little human oversight. Definitely possible, probably not a reality as of right now, given the maturity of that space, but like I definitely see us going in that direction.
I've actually been part of some other discussions recently, which were kind of echoing exactly what you're saying. I do think, you know, really that kind of contextual information is sometimes difficult because sometimes that's the tribal knowledge that doesn't get down on paper, you know, and as humans, we can go and ask the other person,
right,
you know, but actually if we want to get the best out of that vacuum cleaner, we need to be able to give it that contextual information. I do like the overlap with IDPs, you know, I love that kind of making sure that everything has all the right, you know, the right information in there so that you can, when you're saying, hey, I'm working on service A and I'd like you to generate some code for doing this, it can go and look at the documentation, understand all of that, and then say, oh, okay, actually, and based on the architectural guidelines that we have for our services, I can give you much better outcomes in helping you scaffold out that code and solve that problem.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can trace, like what's more like also important, you can trace everything that happened, like because everything is in one place, basically.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to follow on here because I know you work with regulated environments now. And so stepping on from that kind of, you know, using AI for doing those things, you know, how do we make sure that that is still secure and meets like auditing requirements and all of those things? Because that is also a challenge right now, right? How do we make sure that, you know, those tools have the right access to the right information and they're sharing it with the right people and all of that? I think that is another challenge. I'm sure you have an opinion given where you work now, and I know you work with those regulated environments.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I guess where we trip oftentimes is like human in the loop when it comes to like data leakage or like security breakthroughs. So my first kind of instinct is to like automate as much as possible, as in like bake security standards into like my DevOps pipelines. So it's like a proper DevSecOps situation, yes, right? And like it's not an afterthought, it's something that happens by design. It's like providing proper like knowledge and information because it's part of it, right? That's also something that like we're in the business of learning and we all know that like platform and tool and like platforms and tools as well as like people and kind of their understanding of how this works is equally important. So we're trying to kind of keep developers educated on the most recent kind of angles of attack, threat modeling, that kind of stuff. So it's like a combination of automation and folks being properly informed about like what are the threats and what are the potential angles that exist right now that they need to be mindful of and like defensive to, pretty much.
Yeah. I love that actually, because we've almost ended up at the start, at the end, which is realistically, even looking at the future, it's about planning for it. It's about making sure you're designing those things and not just trying to ad hoc them for a quick win, you know. So First of all, I have to say, or I guess finally, I have to say, thank you so much for joining me for this chat. It's been amazing. Thank you all for joining me too. And again, thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll do another chat again soon.
Of course, you betcha. Thank you, Martin. This was
Thank you.
great.